I mean, what do you want me to do? Freaking be excited about having to get filthy and cut into what's probably a perfectly good steering rack? You know, it's just dirty and ugly, but it's fully sealed up. There's no fluids leaking from anything. The lines aren't even rusty. The fittings are a little crusty a little bit. Tie rods are shot as far as the boots are concerned, but other than that, there's no real floppy slop in them or anything like that. You know, the inners are nice and stiff, and can say the same thing about the outers, but the boots are trash. So, pair of tie rod ends, and it would be perfect. But I'm not going to come back with hydraulic steering in the GSX. All the hydraulics are going away because I am completely fed up and sick of them. This is probably going to come back with Prius electric power steering unless it doesn't fit correctly or there's something I find detestable about it. So far, I've got some other friends that have tried it and have done a great job. Holy cow, it's not even running. How are you doing that? Man, you been working out?
I might have some magical supplements before you do.
Well, that is your right arm. Oh, you're left-handed, aren't you?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. So that's your weak arm. Gotcha. That's pretty fancy, man.
Yeah, that's a pretty neat deal. I like it. Turn up the assist level on
How
it.
fast can you turn it? Good, see that right there. Oh, you got one finger in the wheel.
Yeah.
Do that, what?
It's the magic fingers.
Nice. Huh. That's wild, man. Good job.
Thank you.
Tell me, Abe, how many 1Gs had a black interior?
Including this one, one.
One. There you go. That's pretty fancy. That just punches me right in the brain cell. It's like this is not normal. You did a really good job. My camera lens is not wide enough for this. I'll fix that problem pretty soon. Electric power steering on a 1G. It's nice to see Abe getting closer to the finish line on this 90 Eclipse, but is a project car ever really finished? We're going to crack into this thing and get it cleaned up and look at its innards and its guts and maybe even stick it in the blasting cabinet and get it ready for a rebuild. Yay! So that's what I'm doing here, and before I blow the whole thing apart, I first need to make it short enough to fit inside the cabinet. The easiest way for me to do that is to remove the inner and outer tie rods from both sides of the rack, then put the boots back on. Suddenly I've got the inner tie rods and the boots separated, and it's because all I need really right now is the boots to cover up and protect this end of it in the blasting cabinet, because I'm going to do the cleaning while this thing is completely and totally assembled. So anyway, you didn't need to see me go in there and knock the nuts and the tie rods off of these things. You know how that works, but there they are. I'm just using zip ties and big bolts in the ends of the boots to seal it up. Because the steering rack is a pressure cylinder, aside from its oil feed and return, it's very well sealed up, and that's going to protect it from the blasting media. The outside of this one isn't greasy and oily, just some road grime and a few rust spots to have to clean up, but its appearance still needs to keep pace with the rest of my GSX's cosmetics. I won't need to take the paint all the way off to do that. It's not even that bad. It's okay to add a layer of paint if the original protection hasn't failed. But I do want to make all this aluminum look brand new again, and I'm replacing all the seals once we get inside it. And, you know, blasting it isn't going to hurt anything here. Not even the original faded Koyo label that I painstakingly masked with poly tape so that it can live to tell more tales. All sealed up. I've got earplugs in the rest of it. I'm going to tape those in there just to secure them a little bit better. Or maybe cram another one in on top of it. And then go throw this in the cabinet and get her cleaned up. Okay, I lied. I was way too impatient. I just went straight for the cabinet the way it was. I didn't really care. It's only glass bead media. Live dangerously. But just know that you should still use proper protective gear while you're living dangerously. Have ventilation, respiratory gear, and maybe now with the blasting cabinets next to the air compressor, maybe some earplugs.
I started blasting.
This is a message from Matt. Somewhere inside this cabinet's an earplug. Sorry to have to tell you this way, I couldn't find it. I just kept forgetting to tell you at the shop in case you see it in there, but I did learn on camera how the air compressor is on the exact same electrical circuit as the vacuum cleaner. You don't really figure that one out until the cabinet gets really cloudy because of how loud all of it is, but this is why it's nice that I live dangerously with protective gear and ventilation. I can fix that circuit problem in the future with an extension cord so it's all good, but that's all she's getting for now. Looks pretty good, I think. It's a good start anyway. I'm doing this over the dirty old moving blanket that I rebuilt the Gallant rack on because it's got all the same kind of funk seasoned into it already. But the main reason being is that I have to clean everything inside and out that the glass bead media touched. I want all that funk in the moving blanket instead of in my shop or on the table. I've rebuilt a steering rack before, in much greater precision and detail than this one's going to get because it had to be able to hold fluid pressure and work with the rest of a normal hydraulic power steering system. But this time, this one doesn't. There's no manual steering rack that's available for a second generation Eclipse. That's just not a thing. All of them are hydraulic, but because of what I'm doing to this car for power steering assist, I actually benefit from disabling it. So that's the whole premise behind why you're seeing a similar thing again. It's because we're doing something different with it. This is all about rebuilding it so that it doesn't work perfectly. So that it doesn't perfectly work? So that it perfectly doesn't work. Look, it's gonna work. It's gonna work better because it doesn't function. Good gravy. I don't think this might actually be something I can't find the words to explain correct. It'll be perfect for future use because the hydraulics don't function. Sorry that was so hard for me. So if you're trying to rebuild your Koyo steering rack and maintain its hydraulic functionality, I have the video for that one too. This is the primer for an electric power steering conversion for a 2G DSM. So the parts that I use are going to be specific to this car. My goal is to fully disassemble it, clean it, modify it, and put it all back together again. And here are all the pieces now that I've fully and completely broken it, down to its basic bits. Excuse me. You have the rack support bushing, spring, and adjuster screw. There's the lock ring on it that you set it with. There's the pinion cap and nut. The nut is a specific shape, making it obvious which way it goes in there. Next up is the steering rod bushing and the stopper that go on the passenger side of the rack, secured by that safety wire. Here's the hydraulic valve housing, which I need to thoroughly clean due to an earplug falling out, and I'm going to knock that bearing and seal out, clean that bearing real good too, yeah. I'm going to keep the factory clamps around. There's the valve housing bolts, and of course the tie rod nuts, but new tie rod nuts typically come with in the set. I like the factory ones, we'll keep those around too. I got to clean up the pinion gear very carefully because of the earplug slip, and I haven't fully decided what I'm going to do about the tie rods yet. But in addition to servicing all of these parts, I'm going to have to modify the hydraulic lines as well as the steering rod so that it doesn't fight against the electric assist. Because if I'm going to go through all the trouble of adding electric steering assist, then it needs to be able to work as well as it can. All my parts were in spectacular condition after all these years, and there's no reason I can't reuse all of them. I've taken this one apart as far as it needs to go for what I'm doing to it. I'm leaving both of the needle bearing assemblies installed because there's no seals, and I can clean them out just fine with solvents and compressed air right where they are. I'm cleaning the housing and repacking it with fresh grease later. For now, I'm starting with everything else, namely the pinion gear that got lightly contaminated in the blasting cabinet. It was okay the way it happened. The inside of everything was oil coated, so it clogged up the port quickly before I noticed it and plugged it all back up again. It didn't get pumped all through it. I immediately took it apart, but I still gave it the thorough mineral spirits bath and compressed air treatment in every hole and crevice, smacked it around and did it all again. I've got a really old popular video here called DIY Parts Washer that covers this cleaning method very well. It's the fastest and most effective way to get results like these while completely degreasing the parts. And I'm degreasing them just because I want to soak it in a whole new and different kind of grease again. I saved the worst of these for last, ran out of memory card after knocking the seal and bearing out of this thing, but it cleaned up very easily with the same methods. I spent extra time on the valve ports just to make sure all that media was gone. And with a fresh memory card, I cleaned up the rack housing and relay rod, completely removing all of the 30-year-old factory grease. The steering rod got the same treatment to reveal no unusual wear from chatter or contamination. There's just one shiny spot where the rod support bushing contacted it, but I couldn't feel anything unusual. This made me happy. Another thing that made me happy was finding all the replacement parts and having them in this neat little package bundled up ready for this moment. I've got boots, a rack seal kit, inner and outer tie rods, and all the fasteners for the rack treated, bagged, and tagged. We'll just open this rack seal kit and see what's inside. There's press-in seals for the steering rod and bushing, the pinion housing, and a Teflon seal kit. Some O-rings, I'll start putting these with their things, I won't be using all of it, but there's new tie rod washers, a new pinion nut, and this one didn't come with the new stopper wire. Oh well, I knew I saved the old one for a reason. The housing cleaned up nicely, but I need to paint it, so I'm just going to do a quick mask job to protect the nice new looking clean aluminum and paint it the same way the factory painted it. No need to reinvent this wheel. I just want this modified part restoration to look correct is all. I'm not using the correct color even though it's not very far off. I'm using roll bar and chassis paint again because I've already found this is a perfect complement to my powder coating selection that's already all over the suspension and subframe already. You know, it's already. This is not a thing that I want to powder coat. And while that dries, I'll go ahead and prep all the rest of the parts. It's a good practice to warm up your Teflon seals prior to installing them. I warm up what they're sitting on and let it do most of that work for me. I covered the pre-stretch assembly trick to installing these things easily, but I'm going to just roll through this. I'm not doing that in this video. All the methods and tools in this video are the same as the other one, only I'm not pre-oiling parts with ATF everywhere. I'm doing all of this dry. Just take extra care that none of the seals are twisted so that their edges are square inside the grooves, and compress them all back into shape again. You can use a cut soda can and several worm gear clamps for this, but I have the service tool. It's nice. We'll use it again. I'll set this aside for later in it. Now for the pinion gear housing that I didn't film the cleanup on. I'm installing a new seal that came in the seal kit and the bearing that I cleaned up so good that you blow on it and it spins. The service manual says to install these two things together, but I'm not, and for a good reason. This pinion gear housing used to have a constant flow of hydraulic oil keeping everything lubricated inside of it. Now it doesn't. I'm driving the seal in first around the back of its outer edge prior to installing the bearing so that I can smash a big glob of grease between it and the bearing. I'm doing them separately so that I can pack as much grease into here as I can. After driving in the roller bearing by its outer race, I go ahead and pack even more grease in there, more than it needs. This is one of those times when it's impossible to overdo it. Next, I make sure I got the bearing and seal driven in to the proper depth, make sure everything's lining up right, before thoroughly greasing the valve portion of the pinion shaft. I'm just using general purpose grease for all of this. This is all you need for this now that it runs dry. Now just take the pinion shaft and shove it all the way into that housing. Make sure it's seated all the way down into the inner bearing race or else you'll have a hard time pressing the inner seal back in. The reason I only greased half of the shaft is because a different kind of grease is going to go on the lower half of the rack and pinion gear housing. I don't know what to say about the outer bushing seal. That thing gave me such a fit and left me some history to be remembered in the surface of my workbench. I threw everything I had at this thing trying to remove it, and it's as if it was pressed in by the finger of God. I even tried cutting it out, but it didn't care. It just insisted that I spend a whole lot of time and effort with a punch to take the fight out of both of us. Great. Now I can put a new seal right back inside of it again. Clean it up first, of course. I already stretched the new O-ring around it when you weren't looking. I did film that, you just missed it. But to install the seal, first I get it started straight and then I drive it the rest of the way in, sandwiched between the bench and a block of wood. There, bushing's all prepped and ready to go. The most significant thing you'll need to do to complete this mod is to remove the inner seal boss from the steering rod. This is the part that divided the rack into two separate hydraulic chambers, and if you leave it in place with the seals installed, it's going to create pneumatic resistance that your steering system will then have to overcome. Leaving the lines open comes with the side effect of letting moisture in to corrode things. So after cutting and splitting this ring off the rod and picking the snap ring off that secures it, this is just the easiest and fastest way to do it. The rod can no longer be affected by internal resistance beyond what the seals and the rod support bushing provide. No more pneumatic problem. I'm using multi-purpose grease on this end of what was previously a hydraulic cylinder, and the gear side will contain a different grease. If the two of these greases ever mix on either side because the inner seal has gone bad, I really don't care. As long as there's grease, that's all I'm worried about. The bushing goes first, followed by the stopper. When you install the stopper, the spanner hole faces out, and you just have to rotate it so that the pinhole lines up with the slot on top. Next, take your retaining wire and a pair of needle nose pliers, push the steering rod in, and feed the wire back into the pinhole before rotating it back into place with the pliers. Yay! All there is to it. But there's no internal stopper anymore, and the rod can fly out of it since there's no tie rods on it yet. But while we have the golden opportunity, I want to first refill this thing with Mitsubishi Mystery Grease. I just have no other information about it other than special grease kit, and that it's 0.96 kilograms per container, for very known and specific reasons that aren't relevant to this video. I just know that it's the same grease that's in here is all. I grease everything. Bushings, stoppers, springs, I don't care. Grease all of it, just all on the inside. Work it into the needle bearings real good. Test fit the pinion housing to make sure I've got everything reassembled correctly and all of it lines up right. And I do. So now I'm going to pack more Mitsubishi Mystery Grease into that hole than it wants me to try to fit in there. Extend the rod so I can get it all over the gear teeth inside and out, and now reassemble it with the pinion gear housing for the final time. Bolt everything in place and run it down good and tight. Torque specs on the pinion housing bolts are 12 pounds, but you'll be lucky to fit a torque wrench on them where they're located. That's not a challenge, it can be done, but hand tight with a wrench is perfect for those. The seal's doing its job already. The pinion nut gets 18 foot-pounds. I do the thing with the rag and a hammer with a socket to hold it still so that I can torque it, because I don't have the special socket that fits the steering gear end. I don't like vice grips or on things like that that'll tear teeth off of the pinion shaft. It needs those in order to engage with your steering column. They're kind of important. Next, it needs the pinion nut plug, and there's a procedure for this thing's installation that we're throwing right out the window. Provided I put everything back to correctly and nothing changed, and nothing of it did really, the required torque load is going to be reached once the staked dimples from the factory assembly process line back up straight again. This cap supports the pinion gear, and you don't want it to be too tight or too loose. If it made it this long, then it was already in the right place to begin with. So the stake marks are going to tell you where to put it back. It's now time for some inner tie rods to cap this steering rod escapade off. I just can't. I like the factory inner tie rods the most, but I think I'm going to shelf these things and use the new ones so that I have good factory tie rods to spare instead. I know I'm weird like that. Inner tie rods get 65 foot-pounds, or in my case, everything I can put on it with a giant crescent wrench. Next, of course, followed by carefully flattening the lock washers onto them so that they can't come loose. Now that that's out of the way, I can finally install some boots. Here's the boot kit I'm using. It comes with zip ties, and I'm not really a fan of that. There's nothing wrong with those. I just like more of a factory look. This isn't something that I need to revisit anytime soon, and my rack seal kit came with a new set of metal ones. So these are the ones I'm going to use. I situated them on top of the rack so that you can't see the crimps when the rack's installed. And now add the other factory clamps to round it off. And that takes care of the boots. The part you save for last, or parts I should say, are outer tie rods or testing the drag on the pinion gear. That's what this stopper thing here is all about. The factory tells you to torque it to 11 foot-pounds. Do not for any reason go over that or you're doing it wrong. You want that to be the maximum torque you reach. The correct torque setting for the plug is the one that lets you achieve between 6 and 12 inch-pounds of resistance as you do a full rotation on the pinion shaft within 4 to 6 seconds. I got 10 everywhere, which is perfect. And that made me happy, except that I got to do it all over again until I got it perfect again because I forgot to install thread sealant on either the steering rod support plug or the pinion gear plug. You need it on both, duh. You can see it on the bench there. Restake your pinion plug once you're finished. Now it's time for some new tie rods. My mileage is varied, but I typically find a good starting point for outer tie rods, somewhere between 14 and 16 threads onto it. So I left myself plenty of room with the nuts, and I'm aiming for 14 threads. There's the tie rod that I'm using, which is a sealed unit like the factory ones were. It looks nothing like them, but that's what I'm going with. I'm going to have to get this car aligned after assembly because everything in the world is changing about it, and my alignment guy is going to hate me because of how many new nuts and bolts and extra stuff that I'll have to turn, but let's focus back on this for a second. We're not there yet. It's now fully mechanically sorted. That looks brand new, but it's not currently pneumatically sorted. I have to do that still. All I'm doing to seal the rack up is to cut the fitting ends off of all of the lines that were on it. They're steel fittings, making them very easy to modify. I don't need the O-ring seal or the section of line that penetrated through the fitting. I just need the fittings themselves. And I only need the fittings because I have a mat in-house. I've already pushed my effort button as hard as I feel like pressing it. These fittings that were in it were the right size fittings already, and I just need to plug up the center hole in each one of them. So first I'm giving them all a vigorous solvent bath and brushing. And next I'm chopping up a bolt that's roughly the same diameter as the hole after I ground all the zinc coating off of it. I'm doing that to make little plugs that Matt can weld into the fittings. Of course I need one bigger bolt for the one bigger fitting, but this is the sort of thing that you might do to make your plugs faster than you can even buy them if you can. I don't know what the fitting sizes are, I'm guessing they're BSP, but this is an example of how I did it. Not all of you are going to have the same capabilities on site, and I'm sorry. Kinda. Nah, really I'm grateful. So here's what I prepared for them. Slightly cooked pieces of bolts from a grinder with heavily wire brushed and even round filed holes to weld into. There's a chunk of a bolt for each fitting, and I even threw in another little upgrade for Matt to be kind enough for putting up with my gigantic new video equipment. Thank you, Patreon, for the scene that's about to demonstrate, if you haven't figured out already, why the video quality is so much better yet than the Jeffers ever added before, because he's got a new camera. All about that on Patreon, I promise. This is amazing. But yeah, the upgrade I was really talking about is the tiny bench vise that he could ground his welding equipment to make grounding and welding each of these fittings a hands-free operation. My way of saying thank you. Make it easy. Never underestimate the tiniest of vices. They can come in really handy. This probably took 4 whole minutes of Matt's time, and then he was off to something else, the true model of efficiency. Look at how it flashes over once the shielding gas stops. This is a thing of beauty. The video quality is making me verklempt. YouTube doesn't care about my video quality, but I care and my Patreons care. If you care about video quality, color accuracy, or notice that everything's in focus now that I don't have autofocus, really, then you can tell the Patreons thanks by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend who wants to install electric assist on his old hydraulic thing. I'm sure there's gems in here for him. I made this investment to make a permanent improvement on everything you see here. These were going to rust if I didn't coat them with something, and you saw that I cleaned them up to give that something a little extra something to stick to. I stabbed them all through a piece of cardboard to mask them and used the same epoxy paint that I used on the rack. Next I waited impatiently for a day for them to dry, which you didn't have to endure because video. If you recall on the subframe video, the steering rack was supposed to be the next thing installed into the subframe, and these 6 plugs were 50 cents holding up $1 as far as I'm concerned. Paint drying is still faster than shipping, so it's not all bad. I put blue thread locker on every last one of these plugs and snugged them in with a wrench, and that's how I keep all the water, humidity, dirt, bugs, you name it, out of the depowered rack now without introducing any pneumatic resistance from sealing it up. This is how you lubricate a rack that no longer has hydraulic fluid running through it. Grease is your friend. With the rack fully sealed up, now let's grab the bolts and the hardware necessary to install the steering rack into the subframe. They're all just wrapped up together with the sway bar hardware here, which is convenient because that's going on next. The main difference you'll notice between the 1 and 2G racks is how they mount to the chassis. And this 2G unit is bolted down on one side, and it uses a rubber bushing that's normally glued to the rack tube on the other, along with a bracket and another pair of bolts. You can see how the bushing was imprinted by the bracket in the subframe to figure out its orientation and how you should arrange it, but I'm going to go the extra step during install to go ahead and glue it back on using emblem body and trim adhesive. It's great at bonding painted or unpainted metal to plastic and rubber. I'm just hand tightening all the bolts for now. I want to get the sway bar in here next because it fits like a puzzle piece where it belongs. I just have to unwrap it first. This is actually the factory front sway bar. It's just coated, and I'll be installing the Prothane front sway bar set onto it. So glove up for the grease because it doesn't wash off. First I check to make sure I got the right set, and I do. Next I fill each bushing with a half of the included grease, and I don't care if it's too much. I like it to squish out of everything when it's torqued down. That's actually what you want. Hanging it in between the rack and the subframe is a bit tricky. You've got wiggle room to straighten it out when one set of bolts are in place loosely and the other side isn't installed yet. But you have to have the arms facing forward by the time you've got the second set of bolts started. There's a bump on top of the bar that has to fit between the rack and the subframe. It's a tight fit, but that's why you can't take the rack out of the car without removing the front sway bar. They had to make room for the transfer case, so that's where they bent it. Steering rack bolts get 51 foot-pounds. The bolts are different, but they get the same torque load. All the sway bar related fasteners on a 2G get 28 foot-pounds. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the sway bar bracket bolts or the end link nuts. They're all 28 foot-pounds. Did you say end links? Did you say end link fasteners? Brand new factory units to round out the last things that were listed in the Mitsubishi Parts Group 33050 related to the subframe. These are the last things holding up the completion of that job, but it's because of the modifications necessary during the parts restorations that we're going into it. My GSX is coming back with electric power steering. This is my solution to cleaning up the engine bay while eliminating many of the trademark problems that can plague an older car, such as belt squeal and fluid leaks. We all know those. My big, heavy, all-wheel drive car will have power steering with the engine off when I need it, which will actually be extremely useful in the staging lanes at times. It's a great step in modernizing and simplifying a classic car with some modern technology, and all that without removing the physical connection between the driver and the road. There's the entire Prius steering system next to my GSX's steering column. I've had these parts since the same month I moved into this shop. I just cut up my original pristine rack to accommodate this, and it's been the plan all along, so there's no going back now. I'm serious about this mod and about bringing you some great DSM videos. I just wanted y'all to know that I've already got all the parts. Many DSMers have found compatibilities or circumstances that make retrofitting this system a whole lot easier than it could be. It's not a bolt-on fit or anything. This is definitely one of those advanced, it's one of those big jobs, but I'm not going to sugarcoat that one. I'm also not the first one to do it. Gabe Ortega has a great 2G DSM how-to already posted, and if you're doing this to your 2G DSM, then you should definitely go check his video out. I've linked it in the description. He did a great job, but I have big feet and I'm forced to have to try to do something a little differently somehow with all these exact same parts. I still don't know what it's going to look like yet, but it's going to take a Matt, it's going to take an Abe, and it's going to be in another video. Toyota, just like Mitsubishi, has been famous for using Koyo racks for a very long time. Rebuilding or depowering one of their old hydraulic racks would look exactly the same as what you just saw here in this video. But the Prius is one of the earlier cars equipped with electric steering assist, so naturally you'll find a whole lot of common interfaces between the two columns based on the available technology, the safety standards, and the parts suppliers in the area. It's probably helpful that both of these cars are engineered in Japan. I'm all out of steering video content for now, so here's this bucket of soapy water. It doesn't have anything to do with anything here, but while you're here, I want you to know that my Patreons get early access to new uploads, extra content, and discussions, and can even watch ad-free on Patreon from a web browser or the Patreon app for as little as $1 per sponsored upload. I'll even put your name in my credits too. Thank you, Tubes. Most importantly, thank you, Patreon, for what you do for my production. I mean it. Thank you all for watching, and stay tubed.